Thank you. I'm going to try and give this talk from the center of the room. That's not something I usually do, so let's hope this goes well. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I appreciate the invitation from Sarah and all of her people who have worked so hard on this project that we're going to hear about later on. And it's really nice to be here in such pleasant weather. I guess this global warming thing is going to work out for the Basque Country. So this is a talk about economic research and policy, and I'm going to use it as to talk a little bit about two areas of work that I've been involved in over the last really 35 years, and talk a little bit about how economic knowledge has progressed and how that has or has not influenced public policy. And I have to say, this talk was sort of written and focused on, in particular, more US type policy, because that's what I know about. And I'm a little bit less certain about some of the implications for Basque or Spanish policy. Anyway, so the starting point of this talk is the point that economists are pretty influential in public policy areas. In the United States, many government agencies now have chief economists. That was something that started in the 1990s. My old friend Alan Kruger was the chief economist of the Department of Labor. Many others have been chief economists around the different agencies. And there's an important institution in Washington called the Council of Economic Advisors. And one way you can tell how important they are is their office is actually right in the White House. So ordinarily in Washington, proximity is power. So if you're in the White House, at least there's some chance they're going to pay attention to you. And at the same time, there's been significant progress, I think, in economic knowledge and in our understanding of subtle issues that are important for public policy, largely driven by some combination of data, computer power, and methods, as well as important advances in economic theories and models that we have to understand that. Nevertheless, as economists, I think we have to be aware all the time that economic knowledge is imperfect, that even with lots and lots of information available and potentially good studies, inevitably there's a room for a debate within economics. So there's a famous joke about economists that if you put 1,000 economists head to toe, you still couldn't reach a conclusion. And so one of the reasons is economists are a pretty contentious bunch, and they're polarized to some extent the same as the rest of the population in terms of right and left and views about the way the economy should and does actually operate. And then importantly, and something I'm going to be emphasizing today, is from the policy side, I think a lot of policy choices depend on non-economic things or things that are currently outside the set of models that economists have brought to bear. So I'm going to discuss this in terms of immigration and minimum wages. Economists traditionally, so if, for instance, if you were an undergraduate when I was an undergraduate, which no one who's alive in this room was actually that old, but if you were, you would have learned that immigration was good and minimum wages were bad. And that was a pretty widespread view. So I'm going to be talking about what progress has been made, what are the kind of empirical findings that have potentially changed some of those ideas, and how has that changed policy in those two areas. And so I'm going to start with this slide. This is, as I mentioned, Alan Kruger. Alan had this idea, he introduced this to me many, many years ago, of what we always called a side-by-side. So you have your two sides. Here we don't exactly have two sides, but we've got immigration and minimum wages. So for immigration, the plus side of immigration, as I was taught, would be you expand the economy, so you're going to have more GNP. You increase the value of capital and land, obviously, if there's more people. And so that's an important thing, especially if the people who own the capital or the people who own the land are in charge of the government. You're going to, in most models that were discussed back in the 70s and 80s, you are going to increase average wages of natives if you increase immigration. The minus side of immigration was that you're going to lower wages for the directly competing natives. So potentially, if you have, for instance, more immigration in the low-skilled arena, then low-skilled natives are going to hurt. And at the time that I got involved in working on immigration, this was in the 1980s, there was a significant downward pressure on lower-skilled workers' wages in the United States. They'd fallen in real terms for 10 years over the 1980s. And so that was a major concern. People were worried, do we want to do something about immigration if it's going to contribute to further worsening of wages for low-skilled natives? On the minimum wage side, the traditional view was that minimum wages were pretty much a negative. They're going to reduce employment of low-wage workers, they're going to reduce incentives for investment, they're going to raise prices. The only potential plus side of it was that you could maybe increase wages for lowest paid workers. And I put maybe in brackets here because actually many economists in the 1960s and 70s had the view that that wasn't true. That if you raise the minimum wage, all you were going to do was completely kill job opportunities for people who previously earned less than minimum wage. And so they didn't have much data on wages. So most of this discussion was going on in kind of an abstract setting without information on what the wage distribution actually looked like. And so that was a major concern. And so my work back a long, long time ago was mainly focused on these two sides, two questions. Does immigration lower wages for directly competing natives? And to what extent does minimum wages reduce employment of low-wage workers? But there's many other angles and sides, and I'll be talking a little bit about some of that. So before we get there, I want to just point out that this sort of traditional view was based on very, very simple economic models, supply and demand models, without any frictions, without any imperfections in the markets, that are still, in many cases, the go-to models that people use, at least to do a first-round policy analysis of some intervention in the labor market. And what you could think about has been going on in the last 30, 40 years in economics, since I was an undergraduate, is that we've been sort of evaluating these benchmark models with data and trying to consider or reconsider alternatives to the very naive, pure demand and supply type models as that evidence has come in. And the two headlines for my talk, I guess, the two things that I think I would say we have learned for sure. First thing, on the immigration side, we've learned that the pure Malthusian idea about immigration is probably wrong. And by Malthusian, I mean the idea that if you have more people, that wages are lower. That's basically the idea that Malthus had. I'll be talking about that. And on the minimum wage side, I think, and this is probably a little more controversial, but my view is that there's increasing acceptance of the idea that actually employers set wages for most jobs. That isn't the case all the time, but in most cases. And once we take that into account, the impacts of something like minimum wages are considerably more nuanced than in the standard model. So let's start with immigration. And I have, over my career, had a chance to talk to many, many journalists about immigration. And journalists are all Malthusians. I don't know why, but they all believe that if you have more people, you're going to have lower wages. And I think it's very clear to them that if there's more journalists, there's less wages per journalist. Anyway, so this was an idea that was proposed by Malthus in his famous 1826 essay on human misery. And it still comes up, actually, once in a while. If you read the New York Times or any kind of world newspaper, you'll see discussions about this idea coming back. On the other hand, what we do know, well, we know that larger countries do not necessarily have lower wages. We know that inside of most countries, the larger cities have higher wages. That's a very strong pattern. We know that many countries are trying actively to promote population growth. So this is an issue that'll come up, I guess, tomorrow, that with declining birth rates, people are actually saying, well, how do we get more population growth, not less? And actually, some countries, including where I was born in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they actually encourage immigration. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine, I guess, in modern society, and especially 4 or 5 years ago in the United States when President Trump was the president. It was really hard to imagine this, but it was actually true that those countries were still encouraging immigration. So what should we think about this idea that, the Malthusian idea? Well, Malthus was actually thinking about a medieval world where there was a fixed amount of land and nothing else to do. So the only activities of the population were either you were a farmer or you were an aristocrat who was basically stealing money from the farmers and fighting other aristocrats. And in that view, of course, it makes sense. Basically, if you have more people, you're going to push the margin of cultivation out to less profitable farms, and eventually more people is going to lower wages. In the early 20th century, the economists realized that there was a way around that had been sort of proven by the Industrial Revolution, and that was if we could have people doing something other than work with a fixed stock like land, but rather with capital, then we could avoid the Malthusian trap. And so in the modern macro modeling, for instance, the famous model that was invented by Robert Solow in the 1950s, for which he won the Nobel Prize, as long as investment can keep pace with population, then you can have wage growth at the rate of technical change. And so you can have output per worker going up steadily, even though there's an increasing population, as long as you can keep investment up with that. And in fact, more modern growth theories, so theories that were invented in the 1990s and 2000s, theories that suggest that there's some kind of increasing return to human capital, ideas associated, for instance, with Paul Romer, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, says that actually there may be an advantage to a larger population. You may actually do better with a larger population than with a smaller. Now, even though this sort of neoclassical growth theory says that we can have population growth, it does say that if immigrant inflows are non-diversified, so if you have multiple types of skill in the economy, and immigrant groups are non-diversified, then there could be negative effects on the group of natives who are most similar to the new immigrants. So the research agenda in the immigration area, certainly that I pursued and that others have largely focused on, I think, in economics, has been how do we measure the diversity of groups? Like, in other words, how do we measure skills in the labor market, and who's different than who and who's the same as who? And then secondly, what's the evidence on diversity and how that matters? And to answer the first question, I'm going to argue that mainly what economists have thought of trying to do is model diversity by education groups. And so I'm going to present a little bit of evidence on that. And then what's the big picture on that? Well, the big picture is, surprisingly, at least in the United States and Canada, the two countries that I've spent most of my time studying in this area, immigrants and natives are remarkably similar in terms of their overall education distribution. So remarkably, that doesn't really matter. More granular level of skill measurements, immigrants and natives could be different. Okay, so here's some data showing the percent of immigrants and the share of the workforce in each of the fine categories of education in the United States labor market. So less than 8 years of education is a very low level of education for a modern economy. But of course, if you think about your grandfather's generation in Spain or even in Canada, that was fairly common. My grandfather, both of my grandfathers only had 8 years of education. And so that's only 2% of the workforce in the United States, but half the people in that category are immigrants. So that's a category that's very rare among native-born Americans, but fairly common. In the middle of the distribution, 12 or 13 years of education, that's people that have finished high school, and a lot of Americans go to college for 1 year and then drop out. That's pretty common. Actually, something like half of all people who start university in the United States don't finish. And so 12 and 13 years are a pretty big category of education levels, and that share is only about 10% immigrants. So immigrants are relatively rare in the middle of the distribution. And then when we get down to these groups, the master's and PhD level, we start to see an increase in immigrant share again. So what's going on is immigrants are actually at the top and the bottom of the workforce in the United States. And that's true in several other countries. That's true in Australia, that's true in Canada, that's true in the UK. So the way I describe it, if you're thinking about the US labor market, you should think about immigration in the US provides the janitors and the doctors in a hospital. And then the patients are all the Americans. Okay, So what does that mean? Well, if you take a closer look, a particular interest, I think, and probably a focus tomorrow is going to be on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math subjects. In the, at the higher levels of education, bachelor, master's, and PhD, for all STEM workers in the United States with a bachelor's degree, 21% are immigrants. So remember, that's 14% is the benchmark. That's what share of immigrants are in the United States, about the same as Spain, actually. At the master's level, 34% of all the people in the United States who have a master's degree in a STEM subject are foreign-born, and PhD, 30%, 31%. So, and then if we look at some very specialized fields, computer science, engineering, and I put economics over here just for fun, but computer science and engineering, that's the important subjects. You can see it's quite remarkable. At the high end, those two fields are about half immigrants, okay? So United States is a country which we associate with a lot of recent progress in technology industries driven by computer science and engineering. Half the workers, the advanced education workers in that field, are immigrants. Okay, so that's a really important thing to understand about the US labor market. Now, why is that? Well, one reason is because Americans aren't very good at STEM. American students, and you know, I teach at Berkeley, which you may or may not know is basically a science university. It was a university that really came to the prominence in the national situation because of the Cold War. So Berkeley is where they built all, or designed all the nuclear weapons. And that created a huge infrastructure for science research at Berkeley, which has now largely moved away from the nuclear weapons business into computer science and engineering. And we've got tons and tons of these students, and we're a major supplier of that group. Okay, so what's the evidence on diversity? Well, we've seen that immigrants are concentrated at the low and high ends of the distribution, but overall, the college share, so this fraction of immigrants that have exactly a bachelor's degree or higher, is about the same as the native. So if the main focus is on whether immigration is distorting skilled structure in the US economy, the answer is no, it's not. And so that actually is a very important conclusion, because it says in countries where you look at the overall distribution of immigration and you see, well, they have about the same skill as the native, which is largely true in most of the Anglo countries, probably the case that immigration is not distorting the skill structure very much. So we're sort of out of the Malthusian trap, and we're also probably not in a situation where we're messing up relative wages too much. But nevertheless, it's important to get evidence. How do we do that? Well, there's three types of evidence on immigration that are sort of talked about. One is sort of looking at big shocks. And one example of that is, for example, I did a paper many years ago, the effect of this Mariel boat lift, which was an event in Cuba that sent about 150,000 people in a course of a few months, all the way from Havana to Miami, which isn't very far by boat, but and it caused a fairly significant increase in the presence of unskilled workers in the Miami labor market. And I was able to analyze that, looking at Miami relative to a counterfactual. And I would say the innovation in my study, this was published in a very modest journal, and no one ever, I certainly never expected that this would be an important paper on my resume, to tell you the honest truth. But it showed that you could study immigration the way that you study things like interventions in, for example, minimum wages or other things where you've got a treatment group and a control group. And that was a major step forward in a way in the immigration literature. And what my results showed that there wasn't much effect of this mass arrival of immigrants in Miami, and subsequent research looking at other groups has shown the same thing. This is the kind of data that I showed. This is the weekly wages in Miami, and in what I called synthetic Miami, or what I now call synthetic Miami, which is a set of 4 cities that I was using to proxy for what would have happened in Miami in the absence of the boat lift. And you can see a couple of things. Now, I mentioned before, during the 70s and 80s, real wages of low-skilled workers were falling. And so that was going on. This is the log weekly wage, so this is a log scale. And they were falling all through the 70s and the 80s pretty steadily. So about a 30, 40 percentage point decrease. And it's pretty easy to say, well, that's because of immigration. But if you look at the synthetic Miami, basically the trend was the same. And that was a sort of an important, very simple, basic step that anybody, I think, would agree kind of makes sense, but surprisingly turns out to have been a fairly good idea. This idea of looking at the big shocks has been followed up with other examples. Probably the most important one, I think, is the mass migration of Russian Jews to Israel, which basically has a huge effect on the Israeli economy, and remarkably had very small effects on wages in Israel, so really hard to see much going on. It's interesting because you can also study what happened to investment in the Israeli economy, and consistent with the ideas of Robert Solow and others, there was a massive increase in investment in the Israeli economy that compensated pretty effectively for that increase in immigration. A second way that people have tried to study immigration is looking at enclave patterns. So immigrants tend to go where previous immigrants have gone. So Cubans go to Miami in the United States, Polish immigrants go to Chicago, Filipino immigrants in the United States, which is a fairly large group, believe it or not, they all go to a set of cities where there were naval bases. And the reason why is because after World War II, Filipinos were granted a special visa that was available if you went and worked in a naval base. So there's still, even to this day, large Filipino enclaves in a place like Norfolk, Virginia. Even though you'd say, well, what are Filipinos doing in Norfolk? Well, it's because of that. And so with that pattern, you can find predicted inflows when something happens in a sending country. If everybody has to leave Cuba, they're going to go to Miami. If everybody wants to, if people like Russians or Poles want to leave, they're going to end up, a surprising fraction of them are going to end up in Chicago or New York. Pretty predictable. And so you can use that to predict the relative inflows of different groups to different places based on bad stuff happening outside the United States that's going to send people out. And so I used that idea in a paper many years ago and found fairly similar pattern that I concluded from the Mariel boat lift. And others have followed it up, not always finding a zero effect of immigration, sometimes finding some negative effect on native wages, but typically finding fairly small effects. And then finally, let me talk about a slightly important issue, I think something that's probably going to come up again in tomorrow's discussion, which is sort of about the longer run. These studies that I did, the Mariel boat lift and these enclave patterns, are really focused on the shock effects of immigration over the few years. You might be concerned that there's some long-run effect. And one of the important examples that I like to carry around, this has never actually been formally studied, and I think in my retirement that's something I'm going to look at. When I was a kid growing up in Canada, there were two big cities in Canada, Montreal and Toronto. Actually, Montreal was the more prominent. It was the larger and more lively city. And certainly when I was in high school, I grew up near Toronto, everybody went to Montreal for fun and excitement. But in the 1970s, there was a major language law passed in Quebec, and that led to a very strong sequence of reactions. And the most important of them has been to divert all of the immigration, or most of the immigration that goes to Canada, which is a very large annual inflow. Almost none of it goes to Quebec anymore. It almost all goes to Ontario and the western provinces. And so what that has done is it's completely changed those two cities. So now Montreal is a very modest, nice place to live, kind of cold weather. Toronto is a huge, booming metropolis. Half the population in Toronto are immigrants. So Toronto is one of the world cities like Sydney, Australia, Auckland, New Zealand, Los Angeles, London, that has 50% immigrant population. And it's really changed. Toronto made it a much more active center for all kinds. It's part of the tech sector in Canada, finance sector, and so on. So that's a really interesting experiment where you have a massive inflow, and very clearly natives in Toronto are much better off, I think, as a result of that. There's a nice paper, this is a brand new paper, fairly new paper by Antonio Ciccone and Jan Nimczek, that looks at a really interesting historical episode. After the end of World War II, Germany was partitioned. And the Allied parties owned or controlled different parts of Germany. And one part was controlled by the French, and one part was controlled by the Americans. And there was a huge inflow of Germans coming from the former eastern part, Poland, Lithuania, and so on, coming back, repatriated to Germany. And in the French sector, they didn't let them settle. But in the American sector, they did. And Ciccone and Nimczek show this amazing pattern where there's a really big difference in population density on the American side and the French side of this old historical border. Okay? And so the smaller towns on one side are all quite a bit bigger. And they're also higher wage, higher capital, and just more innovative places. So it looks like, again, the population growth caused by immigration probably was a net plus for not just for the short run, but for the longer run of the people who grew up there. So I think thinking about this tabulation on immigration, I think we've managed to show that concerns about this lower wages for directly competing natives are probably second order at most, and maybe some of these longer run issues emphasized by the newer growth theory, the Paul Romer kind of theory, are quite important, that there actually are big advantages to a more active and larger labor market. Okay, what about the policy reaction? Well, the policy reaction has been, I would say, there's been no impact of economic research on immigration policy in the United States or Canada, maybe Canada a little bit. So immigration policies tightened after 9/11 in 2001, and then again substantially under the Trump administration. These days, the U.S. is having a really hard time because the H-1B visas, which are the ones that are issued to all those workers we were talking about in STEM fields, those are highly binding caps now. And U.S. basically doesn't admit any refugees, even though it's a large country. So the U.S. has basically gone sort of in the opposite direction of what you might have thought based on the economic policies. And so in thinking about that, I've written a paper with Christian Dussman and Ian Preston thinking about what this is. But our conclusion is that an immigration policy, is driven not by the economic factors that economists have focused on, but by other things, about concerns about the ethnic similarity of the natives and immigrants, about their religious similarity, about their language similarity, and so on. So those are the factors probably that are far more important in setting immigration policy than all the stuff that I worked on all those years. Okay, what about minimum wages? Well, again, just to come back, remember the theoretical framework here was the Economics 1 textbook, demand and supply model, that said everybody is paid equilibrium wage, which is the same for every employment opportunity that a given worker faces. And if you impose a minimum wage in that setting, you're going to force some employers to cut employment so that they can increase marginal productivity. So the implicit assumption in that model is that everybody is being hired at a wage which is set by the market, not by the employer themselves. Now, as I mentioned, there was an alternative theory due to Joan Robinson, originally in 1933, where she considered a more, I think, arguably more realistic case where employers have a market power in setting wages, and showed that in that setting that at least for a small minimum wage, if you impose a minimum wage, you would expect an increase in employment at the firm level. The impacts at the industry level are more unclear and depends on the nature of competition between employers. And the intuition for that is basically that if an employer has vacancies, they might still maintain a lower wage and not try and match the quote-unquote market, because if they want to match the market, they're going to have to pay more, not just to the marginal worker that they're going to hire to fill a vacancy, but also to all their incumbents. That's the nature of market power. So what kind of credible evidence do we have on minimum wages? Well, one source of evidence is these big shocks. Actually, in the 1940s, when the U.S. first had its federal minimum wage policy, there were some studies done by some of my older colleagues at Princeton in the 1970s and 80s. I met them, and they had worked on this project, worked on these papers. At the time, no one paid much attention to them, to tell you the truth. Kruger and I did this study in 1994 with the same idea, but with a little bit clearer comparison group. So we looked at the effect of minimum wage in New Jersey, collecting up data for restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And there's been many, many subsequent studies following up on our work. Some of these are really sophisticated cross-border studies that look at places on one side of a border versus another side of a border very carefully, combining many, many case studies all at once, and I think those are pretty compelling evidence. There's also really interesting evidence from the UK and Germany, both of which basically had abolished or got, in the case of UK, or never had a minimum wage in the case of Germany, and then introduced a minimum wage in 1996 in UK or 2016 in Germany. And the advantage of these, especially the most recent German study, is there's really good data available. So there's a lot of information to learn about the effect of this increase in imposed minimum wage. I have to say, when this was proposed in Germany, I have a few PhD students who are German and working in Germany, and most of them were strongly opposed to minimum wages and said, oh, it's going to kill jobs. It turned out that doesn't seem to have been true. So I think it's now clear that the employment effects of modest minimum wage increases are very small and can even be positive in some cases. And at the same time, in economics, more generally, there's growing evidence of employer wage setting power that impacts all kinds of other things. And Jan Eckhout is going to give a talk about some of that, I think, in his talk later on in this conference. So I'm looking forward to hearing his perspective on this. So on the minimum wage side, I think we now have evidence that these employment effects are, at least in most situations, small. Now, that doesn't mean that if you went completely crazy with the minimum wage, you couldn't do some damage if it was binding. What about policy reactions? Well, I have to say, the initial reaction, people might find this kind of amusing. The initial reaction to Kruger and my work was pretty negative. I have a very long file folder of all the terrible things that were said about us. This is one of my favorites. This guy, Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize, he said no self-respecting economist would claim that an increase in the minimum wage can increase employment. He didn't really believe Joan Robinson's theory, I guess it's safe to say. Anyway, so there was a very strong negative reaction and not much policy reaction. So nothing really happened on the minimum wage front for quite some time. But in the post-2000 era, for a variety of reasons, and I don't think, much as we might want to, Alan Kruger and I talked about this before he passed away quite a bit. We used to say, well, everyone thinks that it's our fault, but actually it's pretty clear it wasn't our fault. Many states in the United States adopted minimum wages above the federal minimum, which made it possible to do more of these evaluations. So it was good for economic research. The federal minimum wage has remained stuck. So you could say there wasn't much impact of this research at the federal level, but there has been some changes, and in a lot of other countries, there's been, like we saw in Germany and UK and lots of other countries, there's been an increasing use of minimum wages. So I think the general perspective on this has changed a little bit. So to summarize, I'm going to come to an end. I'm going to say I think we now understand a lot more about both of these areas. Part of it is because of availability of data and the transformation of economics from a largely theoretical field to a largely empirical field. There's been improvements also in our theoretical understanding of what's going on in both the immigration side and the minimum wage side, and I haven't really had time to talk about that, but that's really kind of exciting, and for young economists, really interesting. So many economists, not all, but many economists have updated their go-to model of understanding of these issues. And I think this research has influenced the minimum wage area a little bit, not necessarily as much as you might think, but somewhat, but probably not influenced immigration policy, because the fundamental thing driving policy choices about immigration is not the economics of immigration, but something else. And so economists have largely not been active in understanding this other side. So I'll stop there, and I'll be glad to, I believe we're going to have some follow-up questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask a couple of questions, short ones, in order to connect the insight you just mentioned with the situation here in the Basque Country. And first of all, comparing immigration and education level, you mentioned in the case of the United States, highly educated immigration patterns. It's not the case in the Basque Country, unfortunately, and always, broadly speaking, immigrants who arrive in the Basque Country has quite a low level of education if we compare it with the level of education in the native population, which is quite high. So here's the question. What could be expected if this pattern of immigration persists in the Basque Country? I don't know if there is any case of success comparing with other countries trying to deal with this issue.
Right. Well, one thing I think that's important to understand from a policy perspective is that the highly skilled, highly educated immigrants, there is a fairly large supply of them. They're largely coming from India and China these days. That's the major supplier of the STEM immigrants that I talked about. It's also a major supplier of immigrants to Australia, to Canada, to New Zealand. And those immigrants are relatively successful in all four countries. They're most successful in the United States. The Indian immigration case is really interesting because in the United States, immigrants from India are the most educated group in the whole country. Even though India is not a highly educated country on average, it has a lot of education institutions. So that's the Indian immigrants who choose the United States over, say, Canada or the UK or Australia. There's some interesting studies of that. So why do the most educated ones go to the US versus other countries? And it seems like what's going on is the people who are making the immigration choices are driven in part by education institutions. So some of them are coming to get a PhD in the United States. That's what I did. That's when I moved to the United States. And the U.S. has been lucky to have these large institutions which have been very open to foreign students and have been a source of innovation. And a lot of those STEM graduates that we talked about actually got some of their education, maybe the PhD or the master's level, in the U.S. So that's been a major driver. And that's also true in Canada and Australia and Britain. Mm-hmm. All three of those countries are educating a lot of immigrants from Asian countries some of whom are staying on and contributing to the national population. So I think you need to have an active university group, but you also need to have, the other thing I would say is that immigration is a decision that it's very difficult for people to decide to leave their home country. They're going to lose their culture. They're not going to have the grandparents to help raise their children. They're going to possibly lose the language. Their children are going to grow up. Their children are not going to be what they were. They're going to be Americans or Canadians. And so that's a major, very difficult decision for people to make in some cases. And so you have to offer, the environment has to offer those parents or potential parents the belief that their children will do well there. And they have to be confident that if their children go there, they're going to be able to get educated and become competitive on the world market for skills. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I couldn't emphasize that enough. That's really been a driver in the successful universities and in the successful immigration programs in the countries that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Hello to Elon. Thank you so much. And the last one, perhaps the most general one, because you have mentioned that, of course, the academic research that has got enormous impact driving some policies, but not all of them. So sometimes it looks like there is a kind of dissociation between academic research and policies, suggesting in some of your quotes that perhaps you should be doing better. What can we do? which is the bridge we need to go through?
Well, I'm not an expert in that area, but obviously an event like this is one way. Sometimes I think there's a temptation, especially in the U.S. media world, to basically take, when say most findings are one way, 85% of findings are one way, like in climate change, for instance. So let's say 95% of scientists believe in climate change. 5% either don't believe or are paid not to believe in climate change. And yet, a lot of times, those two sides are put up as equally valid. And it's very difficult for an ordinary person to really understand whether one side is more valid than the other, because a lot of times it's relying on very technical. Did I just drop?
think it wasn't yours, neither mine. Someone else is making noises.
Should I just keep going?
Hello,
So it
please.
relies on
Excuse
this
me.
very technical understanding. And so I think we need to try and do a better job of conveying impartiality as well as some understanding that if somebody is telling you, okay, what you're currently doing is not going to be feasible in the long run and it's going to be very difficult, that people don't want to hear that message. And so you have to sort of say, well, the reason why I'm telling you this is X, Y, and Z. The evidence for it is this, and you have to be understanding and patient. And I think, in some sense, a bit of skepticism about what the experts are telling you is necessary. Sometimes the experts will tell you stuff that isn't necessarily 100% correct. My career, I would say I tend not to. Maybe I've been somebody who's benefited from helping to question conventional wisdom. So we need to understand that even if our understanding of a subject like the labor market policy or immigration policy is somewhat incomplete, and we have to be a little bit humble about whether we can answer every question confidently or we can only say, this is our best guess. And I think if you come across more honestly and humbly, maybe you would have more impact in some cases.
I hope so. Thank you so much, and let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you so much, Professor Kart. It's been an honor and pleasure. Thank you.